of the Bible study Genesis and Immigration. Each week I learn a new big idea as well as lots of little ideas that support that big idea. So I'm anxious to see what you have for us today. Welcome, John.
Thank you. To recap just a little bit the last 2 weeks, we've learned that almost every character in the book of Genesis is an immigrant. There are some exceptions, but most of the people we read about, you would do safe to assume this is another immigrant. And they're living with the same range of situations, challenges that immigrants today would live with. They may have traveled thousands of miles to be at a new home, and not all of their family made that trip with them. So there's a sense of a broken family and of loneliness in the midst of this. They are put into lands that speak different languages and have people with different customs, so they never quite fit in, or at least not for a long time. And the others who have been in wherever they've immigrated to can see that they're different. It may not be a skin tone difference. It may be a different speech pattern. It may be a different kind of clothing. There are lots of ways we can discern difference, and these immigrants are always seen as different. But the difference isn't very well understood at all. One of the concepts that has come recently is a degree of cultural competence that recognizes I grew up in certain contexts, in certain cultures, but over time I can have the ability to learn about other cultures, and I can be, to one extent or another, competent living in that culture. I know how not to offend, and I know how not to take offense. And I may be able to suggest some things that people from another culture will find comforting, or maybe kind of laughable, the way an outsider like me does some of these things. I grew up in a family that was proud to have Swedish heritage, and Swedish Christmas traditions ran a little different. And so in the US, there was a lot of attempt to get the old traditions to stay and invite others in to see if they would learn them. Now, one of those traditions, Christmas Eve, involved the figure of Saint Lucia, a kind of patron saint of Christmas, much more important in Sweden than old Saint Nicholas had ever been. And Saint Lucia was one who brought cookies and other goodies to people as part of a Christmas light festival on Christmas Eve, to be played by ideally a daughter in the family around 16 years old, and would carry this plate of cookies and goodies around from one person to another and say Merry Christmas. Saint Lucia, you could always tell who was playing the role because she had candles in her hair. A wreath of candles that were brightly shining, and she would be the brightest thing in the room and would bring the light of Christmas and the good tastes of Christmas. In the United States, it was very frowned upon to have non-Swedes take that role, mostly because those of us who didn't grow up in Sweden, like me, really had no natural understanding of how to walk with 12 candles in your hair and how to bend over with a plate of cookies and make it through the house without setting the whole thing on fire. And so that was a cultural competence. I learned that I didn't get. I learned how to make some of the cookies. I learned other things, but not the flaming headwear. And we kind of understand that cultural competence can be a good thing. So when it comes around Christmas time, I greet some of my Christian friends with Feliz Navidad. I greet some of my Jewish friends with Tov or other things. There are different customs. And immigrants are always in the process of learning how to mix the customs they grew up with, the customs they're learning, and where to perform them and how to do them right so they fit in. So that's part of what goes on with all of these immigrant families. Another part that we've seen is that God uses immigration to form and save peoples. Abraham was told to leave the place of his birth, Ur in the Chaldees, and go to a place that God would not tell him where that was. Just follow God in a generally easterly direction. And I'm guessing that's a 2 or 3 year walk across some pretty desolate areas. When Abram gets to the place and God says, "You're here." Abram is following the call of God. And since he's left behind Ur, he doesn't realize the war that would have ravaged his hometown in Ur a couple years later. But the immigration is saving Abraham and his family from death in a war that was unforeseen when he left. In the Passover, in the book of Exodus, God has heard that all of the Israelites are in Egypt, are in slavery, and their mistreatment and oppression only keeps growing. At first, there are laws against Israelites having many children as part of that oppression. Before long, that turned into the murder of children because of part of that oppression. And their life was bleak. But through Passover, God designed a way to release the Israelites and their friends from other nations out of slavery and walk them out of Egypt. So they would no longer be Egyptian, they would be the people who crossed over, or what we call Hebrews. And as Hebrews, they could live free in the land. They had to make their own decisions for themselves. They had to figure out how to run a city and a village to take care of each other. So there was a lot of learning to do, but immigration was the way that God set people free from slavery. And that is still true in the world today. There are many people enslaved in their home countries, or mistreated, or in the risk of government sanction to end their lives, who out of that context choose to move. They hear God calling them toward freedom, and they immigrate somewhere. And maybe just as with our biblical characters, they don't really know where they're going. They're just trying to get out of something. And they stop for a while, thinking, here's a place we can rest. Here's a refugee resettlement that would be good for us. And then eventually move on from there. It may be 4 or 5 stops on the trip for an immigrant to come to a new home. So we talked about a number of the reasons why these acts of immigration happen. It can be at the direct call from God. They could hear of something wonderful in another land and be following that. They could realize how bad they have it in their own land and be escaping that. They could, in a lot of cases, there's fear of famine. 2 bad years of crops where I live, I'm going to start seriously thinking about moving elsewhere. After 3 years of drought, I'm not sure things will grow back, even if we have rain, and I've got to move somewhere else for my sake and the sake of my family. And so one of the things that God does through the repeated rescue of peoples in Genesis and Exodus, we've seen, is to try to create a society where there's no legal or social distinction between citizen and immigrant. And in fact, it's the first piece of law, about 10 chapters before the 10 Great Commandments even. The first piece of law is never have a rule that applies to only citizens or immigrants. Or to put it the other way, there shall always in the land be one law for both the citizens and the immigrants. No legal distinction. You cannot create an ID card that puts you into one category or the other because we are one people in one category, no matter what our citizenship status or immigration citizenship status. I get frustrated that even some of the people who tell me they're taking the Bible literally and that the law of the Bible applies to them don't want to take that as the base of our American law. It would change everything and might lead us to a more just society. So there's a lot of reasons for immigration. We can't go through all of them. But these issues of slavery, of famine are key. And the issues of immigration by being called by God. So, it's interesting that in Exodus, as God is preparing to lead the biggest immigration in human history to that point, God uses a lot of signs and wonders to get people's attention. Because the powerful in this instance, the powerful who are the slave owners don't want the slaves to leave. The powerful will ban immigration if it means losing their slave population. In some of our world, that can be the other way around, where the rich want to keep the immigrants out for whatever reason they make up. Every reason I've heard to keep immigrants out of the U.S. is based on false facts. As if we were not a country of immigrants from the beginning, and as if immigration is bad for us in some way. And in this argument that God has with Pharaoh, God is willing to mess with the ecology to try to get Pharaoh's attention. And if Pharaoh is a observant and protective leader for his Egyptian culture, he'd be terrified of these things. There's a day when all the rivers turn to blood. There are days where birds fall dead out of the sky. There are days when the frog population takes a huge increase, and the frogs come out of the river basin and take over every city. The cities are not very good for frogs. The hot desert is not good for frogs. In a couple of days, you've got a city full of dead frogs, and somebody's got to sweep them out. And so these are annoyances, but it shows God's control over nature and God's willingness to use nature as a way to manage people and immigration. And so, because Pharaoh was stubborn, none of those ecological issues became a reason for Pharaoh or others to leave, or to understand why immigration might be a sensible response. But there's another story back in Genesis of an immigrant who works differently and responds to nature. In Genesis 6, God says to Noah, "I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and I'm going to destroy them along with the earth." And so God has Noah build an ark for the whole household, and they fill up the ark. It takes Noah about 100 years to build this ark, and to fill it up with not only family, but animals and even plants of all sorts, a kind of new Eden in this ark. And then the rains come, and the ark lifts off, and it rained for 40 days. The start of January, here where I live in San Bernardino, we had rain 15 days straight. It added up to a little more than a year's average annual total rainfall. And so there was some flooding and sliding, and things were around. 40 days is a lot longer than 15. 15 is an annoyance that destroys some people's houses and messes with the electrical system and everything else. 40 days is much worse. And so Noah and his family wait until the flood is over and he can see out of the boat and he can see that the land is dry. And by the end of chapter 8, he builds an altar to the Lord. And in chapter 9, God blesses Noah and his sons and repeats what was said to Adam at the start: "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." But Noah and the family are not where they started out. After that long a flood, they probably wouldn't even recognize where they used to live if they walked there by accident. All they know is where God has landed them in the boat, and around that boat they begin to take hold and build a new society. They are immigrants because of natural catastrophe. They're climate refugees, not because of human-induced climate change, but because of God-induced climate change. And I think we're beginning to hear about climate refugees in these days, and we're going to hear a lot more of that. Last fall, up in the high desert, not too far from Cathedral City and Indio and places like that, there was a mountain community of about 20 houses that did not get washed away by the rain, but their road did. That cut off electricity, water and sewer, and any transportation. They got food for a few days by airlift, with helicopters dropping things down. And then pretty quickly the story was forgotten. The estimate is that they can open up the road to evacuate people in summer 2024. So they have only 18 more months of living there with no food or power, and with helicopter airlifts providing everything they need. I think those 20 families, well, knowing humans, some of them, when the roads are open again, will stay right where they are because it's their house and they're not leaving. And others are going to say, I'm going to move closer to a place with real roads where it's still passable even in the midst of climate change induced weird weather. I like to think I would be one of those who wanted to move to a safer place. We have seen in Northern California almost every year lately where massive forest fires take out entire cities and leave nothing standing. And most people choose to relocate in other cities and start life over. These climate refugees are happening in stories all up and down our state and much around the world. Indonesia recently finished building a new capital city because they think in 10 years their old capital city will be underwater. Many of the Pacific Island nations have their highest elevation at around 5 feet. And they're not likely to survive another 5-foot climb in seawater levels. And so some of them are beginning to wonder where they will go. A lot of the individuals are moving to the US and bringing new cultures to us. So there's climate is becoming one of the significant reasons for people to move. And it will become all the more so. And like with any immigration, it will break up families, it will destroy neighborhoods, it will scatter people so that their traditions, their customs, their language will now be in a different place. And they will assimilate and share their culture with those around them in one way or another. Noah's story is a story of how hard this turns out to be, where his sons get into disputes with both their parents, and they have a lot of falling out, and pretty soon the three sons are rival nations. They all learned from the same climate disaster. They learned different things. They went in different directions. And there was not a single community after that. So God keeps pushing people to migrate out from the center and experience new places and new traditions, new cultures. In a time of climate change, no matter what causes it, this is a very frequent pattern. If we wanted to get into some more complicated, less familiar Bible passages, we could see a number of other ecological effects. Especially when ancient Israel started to move from the remnants of their Stone Age technology to doing some technology with bronze and later with iron. Iron production is complicated. It requires high heats, and that means you have to build kilns in certain ways to focus the heat and run the risk of others being exposed to that. And some of the natural chemicals they found to color pots in kilns or other things ended up being toxic. Maybe the plants weren't toxic if you licked them, but if you burned them at 1,000 degrees and melted them, there would be some toxicity in it. So iron forgers had exceptions to many of the Israelite laws. They were not supposed to be with other people. You do not go and buy iron products near the factory. Instead, you have other people who will transport them back and forth. And iron forgers should give up their kilns and factories every year or two and move on to a new place, because they were leaving behind toxic metals. And it was forbidden for anyone to go near those again. Because if you went near them for the next 50 years, you would get heavy metal poisoning of some sort. So there's an awareness of how nature and our transformation of nature would cause a need to change our patterns of immigration, would take good areas to live in and turn them into bad areas to live in. By Jesus' time, some of the factories where those things would be made were put in caves so that you could block up the entrance afterwards and keep the toxic metals inside. The problem with that is that in a housing crisis, those shuttered facilities get unshuttered and used as housing. And the people who were too poor to afford their own houses, but who went to live in the caves, got sick. and there were massive illness problems. And with metal poisoning and other such things, a trouble with mental illness. The medicine of Jesus' time barely understood those processes. They had figured out you could drink mercury if you had a stomach ache, and it would make you throw up what was causing the stomach ache. They had not figured that it would get into your bloodstream and cause worse diseases later. They knew they knew that people who live around those, what we would call toxic sites, but they would talk about abandoned areas or areas where people should not live. And they would say that the people there suffer from bad air. Fairly astute observation. But because in the biblical languages, air and wind and spirit and breath are all the same word. When they complained about areas where the air was bad and would make you sick, they were also saying that you could get bad spirits there. And the bad spirits could affect your mind and your soul. And so around those areas that had been used for metal production and then abandoned sites, there became a huge amount of mental illness. And Jesus dealt with the mentally ill in so many of the stories in the Gospels. It was a human-made crisis that became a climate crisis because of producing bad air that couldn't be contained and made life miserable for many. Those who could see it coming, those who were wealthy enough to be proactive, were able to immigrate away from those areas and be in healthier places. But as the use of metal got greater, the use of kind of early age industry became greater. There were more and more places that became uninhabitable. The Dead Sea was a place where a lot of those kilns and metal production would happen and just dump the toxins into the sea. And to the extent that people had in the hills any sort of plumbing, everything empties into the sea. And then everything in the sea dies. And then it stinks more, becomes more of an eyesore. It becomes a place to breed other kinds of diseases as well. What began with human industry turned into a climate catastrophe that poisoned a lot of people and drove local residents out. I don't know what kind of climate disasters are right ahead of us. I don't know how long it will take us to realize the science behind it. I don't know how long it'll be before we really have ways to protect people again. But these will continue to happen. And when parts of the country become too toxic for good human health, we'll be faced with two choices. One is to get everybody out of there and get them to safety. And the other is to let some people live there and be willing for someone else to get sick so that we can live in our good, clean air areas. Immigration, taking people away from spoiled land, can be a salvific act of God. But if we take the easier path and just get the people we like out of harm's way and let the others, the disadvantaged, however our society carves that up, let them stay in the midst of the disease to come, I fear we're not doing anything ethical. We are not providing a way out as God would have us do. So I think this is an issue that'll keep happening and will affect us more and more. Sometimes in climatological things that we just don't see happening. Or in some of the things that we can see happening at a great distance, like a rise in water levels, that will, those projections that by the end of this century, Manhattan will be underwater, and most of Florida, and about anything within 10 miles of the California coast. And those people will need a place to live. Will we accept those refugees in? Will we learn from those immigrants how to live with them and how to be good neighbors? Those are some of the big questions for us ahead. There are so many small references in Scripture that back this up. God knows, and there are many tales that when fish die in quantities and float onto the coastline, the dead fish breed disease, and flies who frequent those dead fish will catch those diseases. And if the wind changes and those flies end up being pushed into your neighborhood is at risk from those diseases. And it might be just a few blocks away, or it might be 1,000 miles that these contagions carry. It leaves me thinking that world health, global health, needs to be one of for centuries, for millennia, global health has been one of God's greatest concerns. We have been very slow in understanding what God has always known, that the health in one part of the world will affect our own health, directly or indirectly, one day or another. That if there are toxins in different animal supplies that creates mutations, it will harm us all, and no part of the globe will be safe. And this kind of relocation, dislocation will increasingly be some of the ecological and refugee crises of our era. And our task now, perhaps, is to think how we can be prepared, how we can, and this is very hard for us. When we did forced immigration of slavery in the U.S., it took us a couple hundred years to say it was wrong. And it's taken us about 150 years since to pass more laws and for people to forget why those laws had to be passed, for racial justice to be still out of our reach. Changing about 3 sentences to the Constitution in the 1770s could have gotten us on a better path. If we had taken the Bible seriously, that there's no legal difference between citizens and sojourners, and so that everybody must be created equal and given equal rights, if we would have followed through our own logic a little better, the last several hundred years of U.S. slavery and its aftermath might have gone much better. But now we're seeing how our industrialization and how our poisoning of the planet is going to damage almost all of us. And there may not be enough safe, healthy places left for us all. We still have a chance to get ahead of that and to prevent the problem from being as severe as scientists tell us it will be. And this is a struggle. I live in a part of the country where I need to run my air conditioning on full most of the year to make living here comfortable. There's just about nothing within walking distance, so I spend a lot of time driving. I keep doing things that I know don't make things better. But I'm stuck in my ways. My grandfather knew how to live without cars or paved streets or things like that. I don't know. And it's hard to convince me I should learn. So some of these matters of immigration are very long-term. Do we want to create the places where we live now into ones that will be sustainable for human life for generations or centuries to come? Or are we willing to mess it up and then say, we sure hope nobody lives where we do anymore? I think what we see from Scripture is that whether these are meteorological accidents or the result of human use of the land, or a result of natural rhythms, such as some years are drier than others. In every case, we need to be prepared. And we need to know that what we do in one place will cause problems down the road. As the world fills up, it's a little harder than it used to be to solve things with immigration. We don't have the systems to welcome people into new countries, so they stay for years in refugee camps in the tens of thousands. This year, due to war in Ukraine, Poland's population grew by 30% as they brought in refugees from just a few miles away from them. Population explosion without any new housing, without any new jobs, without any new goods or a bigger source of food. I tend to think theirs was a reaction of grace. But it is difficult for all. Will we set up healthy and clean and sane political practices that put some limits on the damage that is going to be caused? Or are we willing to put up with the supreme disruption of immigration? And so many today in our politics believe that immigration is bad, that letting in those other people will be hard on us. But we don't realize that the policies that make it harder for people to come in make it harder for some of us to get out if this becomes the place we need to leave for salvation. And it be the problems that our grandchildren struggle with, and wondering what places are still livable. We can pray for God to send each of us a call about where to live, or to find us a new garden where everything is safe to eat. But we should also be thinking ahead. To think that if we are exclusivist, we are violating the law of God, that all people live together with only one law. If we stop people at the border because some of them don't have the right legal documents to enter, we have gone away from God's most basic law of having only one law for everyone. The divisions we create around immigration, the ways we make it harder for people to intermingle, to learn each other's traditions and cultures and languages and faith, separates us from God. Every time we erect a border wall or a fence, God lives on both sides. And what we're trying to do is break down the body of God. Humans have never done well with that strategy. So, we have a little more time for some questions.
Thank you, Professor John. And let's see. We have people here. Does anybody, did a thought come to mind? Did you have something to ask? You can come right here and ask it if you want to. Hey, Dell's on her way. Come on down here, Dell. I'll get a chair for you.
We're trying to be not a little bit less freezing.
While Dell is getting here, there were so many good things that you said there, but I had one thought while she comes to sit down. This idea of one law for all people, citizens and immigrants, is just, really eye-opening that it's there before all other laws. One of the things that people have trouble with today is laws that give opportunities for people that hadn't had opportunities in the past, sort of reverse discrimination. Do you ever get any pushback on that? That there shouldn't be laws that afford minorities certain opportunities over non-minorities, or immigrants' opportunities over non-immigrants. Have you ever gotten any pushback on that?
Oh, yes, certainly. And I think part of my response is that what God wants to do is create a world of true equality. And that means both equal access and equal outcomes. And I spent a lot of my life in higher education. In the United States, everyone who grows up here has access to go to grade school for free at a pretty equal level of quality and closeness to homes. It's not perfect, but there's a pretty good equality of access. Dropout rates are so much higher for people of color and for people of ethnic minorities. They never feel like they fit in. They have fewer experiences of teachers really trying to get to know them and help them engage. They don't have as many personal or family resources to get over the obstacles that come. And I would tell you, every student, no matter where they came from or how bright, will find some obstacles in the process. And our goal is to identify the obstacles early and help people get over them. Even though we've managed to do pretty well with equal access, our outcomes are not equal. The graduation rates, even in a lot of colleges, whites are 3 times more likely to graduate than others, and get the advantage of a full education. And so those tell me that what we've done with equal access isn't finished yet. We really need to make sure that everybody has not just equal access to take steps toward a good job and an educated life. We need to make sure everybody possible gets there. And some of our individualistic mindset, where I start class with 30 students and in the first week I fail a quarter of them and winnow them down to the truly deserving ones, I don't think is a teaching process that fits with God's command. God's command is that education continues until it's done.
Very good.
Not until the time is up.
Right.
Hi.
Okay, this is Dale.
Hi, Dale.
Hi. I don't think that education is done. I mean, when are you done being educated? I'm 89. I'm not done yet. I still have a lot to learn.
Right.
Mike came up here because I wanted to note the quandary. It seems to me that most, but not all, of Native American communities have a lot better attitude toward the earth and the preservation thereof and the sharing thereof than what any of us have been taught.
Right.
So that's, did you want to comment on that?
Well, part of what happens in immigration, part of why immigration is so good and healthy, is we each grew up in different ways, we each learned different things, and if we put our knowledge together and discover from each other, we should have better solutions for all the challenges we face. And yes, a lot of Native American people grew up with a much better reverence for the earth and a much better understanding that was taught to them so young it's kind of intuitive of which things in nature, if you put an effect in nature of one kind, where will the consequences be seen? They understand that holistic connection better than I do. And so when I am with Native American people, this is an opportunity for me to pay attention and to begin to learn some of their ways. And if some of those ways I can figure out how to make work in my own life, I will be stronger. If we can get that going both directions and keep it going for decades, we will all be stronger.
Very good.
So,
Okay, thank you.
I was at that, Janice and I went to the celebration down here at the Coachella Valley, where the bird singers did their songs. It was tremendous. But
Yes.
But they all are they're very related to nature, animals, plants, seasons. Everything was about our world. So
The singing of the birds is a very old custom among the Coachella Indians that are here, and they've just built a beautiful new museum and restored the natural spring, and now they're doing this kind of entertaining, they're just educating us there. And
a great example.
And it's wonderful. We need to be participating in that and appreciating.
Having said that, Janice and I were surprised at how few non-natives were there. In fact, I looked out and I could find my wife in a second. She was the only blonde-haired person in the whole place. So I think we could avail ourselves a lot more. Well, thank you, John, for another wonderful week. Do you have just a little tidbit for what's going to happen next week?
Jesus will appear next week.
Oh, good. Okay. That's great. I was just actually wondering about some questions about how this theology and sharing of ideas and would fit into his ministry and his teaching. So, all right. Very good. Well, thank you for coming and being a part of it. We look forward to seeing you next week. And if you're watching this online, we hope you can join us in person. And we'd love to have you. If not, please keep tuning in. All right. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.